Dude, I want you to be as smart as I am.
Motherfucker, give me a...
Dude, I want you to be as smart as I am.
Motherfucker, give me a...
Dude, I want you to be as smart as I am.
Motherfucker, give me a...
Dude, I want you to be as smart as I am.
Motherfucker, give me a specific...
Dude, I want you to be as smart as I am.
Motherfucker...
Come on out, you rapist!
Dude, I want you to be as smart as I am.
For the 15 on the super chat, started off right. I see hit the like button, no chaps, and add a little something in support of our fave content creators. Keep up the good work, Sister Shay Sade. Lots of love. London, England. Shout out to Malarkey. Shout out to Hakeem. All of you guys here. I am really excited about today's topic. As many of you guys know, there is so much misinformation out there regarding history, especially in regards to the Black community. And I think we should start to value, we should start to just value historians more and value those who are actually doing the work, value the elders who actually have the credentials to tell us what's going on. So I'm really excited to have special guests coming on today who are, trained professionals and have all the information that we need to really make sure that we are telling the story correctly and accurately. So without further ado, I'm going to bring everybody on. We're going to get right into today's topic that I think is going to be really interesting and really insightful. So let's bring on everybody to the panel. We have Dr. Jahi Issa with us and special guest Dr. Gerald Horn, internationally renowned best-selling author. Really honored to have both of you guys here. Thank you again for taking your time to just share with us today.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'm here. Okay, I heard a little. Are we good? Can you hear me?
Now, Dr. Horn
Yes,
is in his 70s.
Okay, good. Yeah, so I'm really excited about today's topic, the Counter Revolution of 1836. Really, I have a few questions of my own, but I just want to put my listening ears on and listen to the professionals before I start asking. So I didn't know if you had anything, Dr. Jahi Issa, you wanted to leave with the audience before we get started into the conversation.
Yeah, I'll just jump right into it. How are you doing, Professor Horn?
Hey, it's all good.
All right, I'm broadcasting live from St. Louis, Missouri. I'm actually at the Library of Washington University. Yeah, so this audience, they are a little familiar with historical topics that are not generally brought up in the public. I've appeared on this show a few times. I just want you to tell the audience where you're from. Where were you born and raised?
I was born and raised in St. Louis, Missouri. Nowhere near Washington University, though, by the way.
I'm almost certain. For those who don't know, Washington University is a Ivy League school, and I'm sure what Dr. Horn is referring to is that during that period, I'm almost certain there weren't many Black people. Not many Black people were even allowed to attend this school, not yet walk across the campus.
I'm afraid so.
So where did you go to high school at in St. Louis?
I went to high school at Beaumont High School. In
You went to Beaumont?
Yeah, it's near Fairground Park.
So you went to a public high school?
Of course.
Oh, wow. Okay. All right. I didn't know that. Okay. Well, very good. Well, we're going to get right into it, Professor Horn. In 2014, you wrote a very exciting book that shocked the American intellectual world, and that was The Counter-Revolution of 1776. And in that book, you're basically saying that you basically overturned the general narrative that the American Revolution was fought solely to free itself from British rule. And now, in 2022, you come out with a book called The Counter-Revolution of 1836. Now, this is interesting to me because up until about 2.
Well, I'm going to give about 5 to 10 minutes before Gerald Horn gets bored with this. This is not a motherfucking sermon. It is a show about history. Let's see how long Dr. Horn puts up with it. And it's the first time I've seen this. So maybe he doesn't.
Months ago, I was in Africa for the last year, and I didn't know that Juneteenth was an official federal holiday. So I come back and I'm hearing all of this noise about Juneteenth. I'm like, why is Juneteenth so significant all of a sudden? And of course, your book is out too. Can you explain to the audience what is a counter? Why are you using this term counter-revolution? What does that mean?
Well, first of all, I'm trying to explain why Black people are treated so atrociously and so horribly in North America and in the United States of America more specifically, particularly when we are told repeatedly that 1776 and the revolt against British rule led by George Washington was somehow a great leap forward for humanity. Now, you cannot reconcile, in my estimation, those two theses. That is to say, it was a great leap forward for humanity, except that Black people were treated horribly and atrociously, except that after the so-called Patriots triumphed, they ousted Britain from control of the African slave trade. They continued moving west, executing genocide against the indigenous population. And yet, this was somehow a great leap forward for humanity. Now, one does not have to be a scholar to suggest that there's something wrong with that argument. So, with the book, The Counter-Revolution of 1776, I began to explore the history of that revolt and quickly came to the conclusion that George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, the other slave owners who revolted against British rule were generally motivated by the fact that England seemed to be moving towards abolition of slavery. Let me issue a footnote here. Some of you are familiar with Gugu Mbatha Roy, the South African British actor. You may recall her first starring role was Belle, Belle. I recommend it highly. Directed by the British Ghanaian filmmaker Ama Asante. And it tells the story in part of what happened in London in 1772 when England was seeming to suggest that abolition of slavery was on the way in England itself. When that decision leapfrogged the Atlantic, it called into question the fortunes of George Washington and the other slave owners who had built a major fortune on the backs of enslaved Africans. I recommend that film, by the way. Don't sleep on that suggestion, that recommendation. Point number two, that in 1762, 1763, London had expressed displeasure at continuing to wage war against Native Americans and turning the land over to land speculators like George Washington, land speculator number one. And so what I argue in the book that you referenced is that when the so-called patriots led by George Washington overthrew British rule, they were motivated by material factors, land and labor. And that when you fast forward to 2022 and see Black men and women being shot down like dogs in the streets, such as what happened in Akron, Ohio, just a few days ago, what happened to Breonna Taylor, what happened to George Floyd, what happened to Sandra Bland, etc., you not only have to argue that this is the legacy of slavery, you not only have to argue that this is the legacy of Jim Crow, US apartheid, you not only have to argue that this is the legacy of the devaluation of Black bodies as a result of those systems of iniquity, you also have to argue, in my estimation, that Black people, by several orders of magnitude, did not support the overthrow of British rule led by their so-called slave masters. And when you fight a war and lose, which is basically what our ancestors did, you can expect to be penalized and pulverized forevermore unless and until you can turn the tables, which began to happen with the Haitian Revolution, 1791 to 1804. So
I'm gonna make
I'll put
a
pin in that
quick
and send the mic back
pause
to you.
here. And this is gonna be harsh. Can you explain the note part? The T-tax bullshit, the simplicity is what, you know what? I'm casting pearls to swine here. If you think the American Revolution was about the the fucking T-tax, then you are literally stupid and white. They have bred you to be stupid. I'm gonna be brutal here.
Okay, with that said,
T-tax.
in your you wrote two studies on the 16th and 17th century.
Yes.
And then in the 16th century, you make a point where why Black people today, Black people in America, why people like me, you, and our host are speaking English, and you give reference.
Let me help another simpleton argument out. It doesn't matter what the fuck she was doing. Was she shot while she was trapping? Whatever the fuck that means. You need to take some of this bullshit and go to Bob's channel or someone. Unfortunately, Breonna Taylor was trapping. She was standing next to a man who shot at cops first. That is literally the dumbest fucking thing. Jewel, where the fuck do you get this bullshit? She was shot in her bed. Read a report. You're telling 160 IQ motherfucking accomplish this and a T-tax analysis of the American Revolution? You're gonna have a hard time in this chat tonight.
To
And
a very important
it's gonna
battle
be what it is,
that took
Jewel.
place in the at the dawn at the dusk of the Songhai Empire in 1592, I believe. And you say after that battle that Africa that the Song.
So Richard, so Breonna Taylor was shot while selling drugs. Y'all motherfuckers figure this stupidity out. The woman was not selling drugs when she was shot. This is the old white, but she was selling drugs. Last I heard, she was in her bed. Where am I getting this wrong? Wait, hold it. The Tatum report? Okay, you mean the Officer Tatum report? Oh, Jewel of Aquarius, you are a moron reading a moron. You mean Officer Tatum? The Officer Tatum? The beacon of truth? Officer Tatum was there on the ground? Jewel, how does 160 IQ keep sounding like a fool telling me about Officer Tatum is the truth? Officer Tatum is a goddamn moron, and the only bigger moron I can think of is the moron who wants to tell me Officer Tatum is not a moron in this chat. Do better, 160 IQ. You are wasting points if you're reading fucking. I don't care. I have video, motherfucker. Starting 2-3 times immediately. She was shooting that after the shooting, Brianna was one of the one who was fine. Bullshit. Dude, bullshit. Shredder, you have shredded your credit. Hey, LOL, whatever, Stanley is the best way to accept the truth. Love it. Thank you for standing down, ma'am. The fuck? The woman was shot. Okay, one of you dumb fucks says she was selling drugs and was shot. The other, the fuck are y'all talking about? Literally, one of you is telling me Officer Tatum is more than a fucking content creator on YouTube. Y'all need to do better.
Empire lost, particularly that.
This is John Galt level stupidity.
Daoud, one of the leaders of the Songhai Empire, he lost this battle against the Moroccans who had united with Great Britain, with the Queen of England, to overthrow the last of one of the greatest West African empires out of the Sahel. You said that battle sent ripple waves throughout all of West and Central Africa.
And by the way, this is a horrible interview. These two are literally, and one of them supposedly has a Dr. Jahi Isa. Eek. He doesn't sound bright. I bet he's a music PhD.
And this opened the door for a more egregious assault from Europeans to come
you know
in
what?
And
I will
take
do
millions
better,
of Africans
motherfuckers.
away. And
Okay.
thus, this is one of the
Here is how I'm going to. Richard, whom I respect totally, says that the camera isn't on. Well, you know what? I am going to make you suffer. There is camera of Dr. Gerald Horn, and you're going to love this. Somewhere or another. There is actually Dr. Gerald Horn on C-SPAN, of all places. This motherfucker is literally a major historian, and these folks aren't treating him like a major historian. I agree. Somewhere down there. Guess I might have to Google it. Well, sorry about this. I thought I had it saved. Give me 1 sec here. You know what? While we are waiting, we can play a trifle. How about let's look at this. Stupidity personified.
Will never date outside my race. But the bottom line is the stats are the stats. It shows the less amount of degrees, the less ownership.
Hey, brother, y'all gotta get y'all money up.
Yeah.
What happened? Your balls drop off?
Often I hear about Black women who are just focused on dating Black men.
If we Black women want to date a semi-tall, successful Black man that makes 6 figures and has not been to jail, our odds are 1 out of 250. Clearly, those odds are not in our favor at this point. So I want to say to my Black men, what do we do as Black women when we say like the dating pool has pee in it? And it's so hard to find a, as y'all would like to quote, high value Black man. Y'all know y'all love some Kevin Samuels. What do we do? I would love for Black men to chime in. Because 1 out of 250, like, I'm getting discouraged out here. Tell me, what do we do? Like, how do we navigate this?
There is a conversation that needs to be had in-house amongst the straight Black male collective. Black women are excelling in so many different areas. They've mobilized. They got their sister thing. They getting their degrees, getting themselves together. Not all brothers, but many. The only thing they got on their damn resume is audacity.
Ooh.
That's it. Ain't got shit else to offer the world but and audacity. It ain't the gay boys.
More Black women are graduating from colleges, which in turn will mean that there, of course, there's Black men that are doing well. But if you have more Black women graduating from college, more likely more Black women might do more than financially better than Black men.
Black women are excelling. They're getting accelerated degrees, graduate degrees, doctorate degrees. They're starting businesses. Black women are running circles around men. If Black women are excelling at such an accelerated rate, how do men keep up with that?
The Black men in America, they're few and far in between. People have been saying this, but it really is true.
Black men being the weakest links, it's nothing new under the sun.
This is what I mean when I say Black men are the weakest links.
Black men are the weakest link. 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 Men are the weakest link. Black 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 men are the weakest link.
I put together a breakdown of the 12 most important social media talking points that can be quantified, and I ranked them between Black men and Black women.
Well, thank God that's over. You know what? I just can't seem to figure out how to tell people that Jewel, you actually think Officer Tatum is Brandon Tatum, I think is his name, 160 IQ or whatever you think your IQ is, and you think he actually has command of the facts. Oh boy.
University of California.
Oh, and by the way, this is Gerald Horne, literally a preeminent historian. This is University of California. I think this is a University of California, Santa Barbara lecture. Those two people didn't know how to use him correctly. He is a leftist. However, he's literally preeminent. Nobody fucks with Gerald Horne, including you, even people, the white historians. Like they don't fuck with Gerald Horne because he literally is an elite historian.
Television. Like what you learn? Visit our website.
You need to read him to actually understand at least his theory of history. And if you haven't, don't fuck with me. You don't know history.
The same religion that's capable of hideous acts of destruction can also be capable of moments of healing.
88, 1996. I came in 1992 as a dissertation fellow, so I had the distinct honor of meeting Gerald then and being influenced by him then, and I continue to be influenced by him. Before Gerald took his history degree from Columbia in 1982, he was a practicing lawyer. He was actually a member of the National Lawyers Guild, National Conference of Black Lawyers, apart from being a practicing lawyer. Then I've got to get into some of the books that he has written since his dissertation on the late Du Bois, Black and Red, W.B. Du Bois, an African-American response to the Cold War in 1944-1963. After that, Gerald had written the Communist Front, Civil Rights Congress, 1946 to 1956. Again, I'm just giving you some idea of the range, because if I were to list or to read off the 30 some odd books that he's written, and I'll say a few things about how we used to tease Gerald about, and I feel somewhat bad about that, because there used to be a point when Gerald used to write 1 book a year. Then he got into writing 2 books a year. Then he got into writing 3 books a year. And so anytime I would go to some of these book signings, and Gerald would say something like, Chris, get back to me on this book. And I would say, well, Gerald, if I get back to you, by the time I get back to you, you're going to have like 2 or 3 more written, So, I mean, come on. He also did a biography of Ben Davis Jr., Black Liberation, Red Scare, Ben Davis and the Communist Party. Many of us know the book that he wrote on the Watts Uprising, The Fire This Time, the Watts Uprising in the 1960s, which was a finalist for the Robert Park Award from the American Sociological Association. Biography of Shirley Graham Du Bois, Race, Woman, The Lives of Shirley Graham Du Bois. Class Struggle in Hollywood, 1930-1950, Moguls, Mobsters, Stars, Reds, and Trade Unionists. From the Barrel of a Gun, the U.S. and the War Against Zimbabwe, 1965 to 1980, Race War, White Supremacy, and the Japanese Attack on the British Empire, Black and Brown, of course, African Americans in the Mexican Revolution, which took the Gustavus Myers Outstanding Book Award. Red Seas, Ferdinand Smith and Radical Black Sailors in the U.S. and Jamaica. I swear I'll finish in a minute. The Final Victim of the Blacklist, John Howard Lawson, Dean of the Hollywood 10. The Color of Fascism, Lawrence Tennis, Racial Passing, and the Rise of Right-Wing Extremism in the U.S. I could swear that Dave Chappelle did a skit on that based on that book. The White Pacific, U.S. Imperialism and the Black Slavery in the South Seas after the Civil War. The Deepest South, the U.S., Brazil, and the African Slave Trade. The End of Empires, African Americans in India. Mau Mau in Harlem, the United States, and the Liberation of Kenya. Most recent, well, not too long ago, he actually wrote a short biography of W.B. Du Bois. For ABC Clio. Then there were a couple of things, Gerald, that were not listed on your CV that I had to add here. Fighting in Paradise, Labor Unions, Racism, and Communists in the Making of Modern Hawaii. Black Revolutionaries, a couple of these books you've seen outside, Black Revolutionary, William Patterson and the Globalization of African-American Freedom. Negro Comrades of the Crown, African Americans in the British Empire, Fight the U.S. Before Emancipation. And of course, today he'll be talking about Counter-Revolution of 1776, slave resistance in the origins of the United States of America. And I think in the next couple of weeks, another book called Race to Revolution, the U.S. and Cuba During Slavery and Jim Crow will be out. Earlier today, Gerald told us about 6 other projects. And with most people, when they tell you I'm working on 6 other projects, that is typically a 10-year plan, right? And then you kind of knew with Gerald, well, that was probably like a 4-year plan. So those will be coming out. But all jokes aside, and Gerald, this is something that I've long wanted to say to you. Thank you. Thank you. For many of us who work in the area of Black folk and the related, and the issues that are related to Black folk that have a global meaning and a global dimension and a global application. Your work has just been, incredibly foundational, pioneering. Even when it is that we think that we know a subject well, we look at what it is that you have to say about the subject, and so often we're saying, my God, I didn't even know this, right? It's much to our embarrassment. Sometimes I actually pick up your books or look at what you've written on Google or Amazon, because many of these books, I have to say, are on my to-read list, right? Some I have read, some are on my to-read list, but I'll actually look to see what works you have looked at, because frequently you give us the most update bibliography, as well as dissertations, as well as telling us where it is that the information can be found. So I really feel that you give us, or give many people a sense of the richness of the variety of Black experiences in the world. But in addition, I think in your many studies of not just Black folk, but you give us some a guide or roadmap or even proof of how it is that the study of Black people can be used to understand other experiences in other places. And so in that sense, I really feel that you have taken the study of Black people, Black scholarship into the realm of universal history. And I think that, you know, to whatever degree you want to follow in the footsteps of Du Bois, you have arrived, all right? I would also say that you were, you know, talking about a short Paul Robeson biography that you're going to be putting out. And I was also thinking that in many ways, I see you as the Robeson in the academy, right? Taking the, you know, some of the specifics of the Black American experience and, you know, discovering in the world other people's slave songs or other people's blues, and using that to be an entry into other people's worlds, and also as a way to understand what it is that other people are facing. So I just want to say thank you, although I do rib you for the amount of work that you've put out, and I will continue to, and I want you to keep on doing it. Thanks so much, Cheryl.
Okay. Oh, okay. Well, just a technical issue we're trying to deal with here. Thank you very much for inviting me back home. Oh yeah, good. I just wanted the book cover to be present as I speak, since I'm going to be talking about this book. And since the book has been published, it's 300 something pages, and I'm only speaking, I guess, for about 40 minutes. There might be some ellipses in terms of my oral remarks, and this is to remind you that you can always consult the text if you want further clarification, further context, etc. But it's really a pleasure to be back in Santa Barbara. I spent many pleasant years here, many productive years here. I mean, as I was landing in the airport, I was wondering why I ever left, in fact. I mean, it's so wonderful, and the environment is so pleasant that people tend to be pleasant as well, I think. So thank you for inviting me. And I'm going to be speaking about this book. But when I talk about this book, which is obviously a narrative of the origins of the United States that cuts against the grain, I always feel compelled to apologize. Seriously, I apologize to the indigenous population in the first place, the Chumash people, the Gabrielino people. I apologize to the Africans, many millions gone. I apologize to the Mexicans who have been dispossessed on this land. I apologize to the people of Asian descent who were interned on this soil. I apologize to all of those who were victimized by the kind of propaganda. And I apologize on behalf of scholars. I apologize on behalf of radical scholars, progressive scholars who I don't think have done their jobs in terms of explaining how we reached this point. I apologize on behalf of Black scholars who I think could have done more to explain how we got to this point. It could have cleared up a lot of confusion. So having said that and having done that, let me present to you this this thesis and its implications. This is a book that talks about the origins of the United States of America. And it's a book that, unlike previous scholarship in this realm, does not begin the story in the 1770s, because I think that's part of the problem with the previous scholarship, in that when you begin the story in the 1770s, in the run-up to July 4th, 1776, I think you can leave a distorting impression, because when men and women choose to take up arms against constituted authority, particularly when odds are great, oftentimes they engage in behaviors that are not necessarily consistent or congruent with their previous behaviors or their subsequent behaviors. What I mean is that if you began to tell the story of the United States, or looked at the snapshot of the United States in, say, 1943, when the United States was in the midst of an anti-fascist war that was compelling the United States in certain kinds of progressive directions, you might be led to believe, as Hollywood films were suggesting at that time, that the United States was a great friend of the Soviet Union, that the United States was a profoundly anti-communist country. You might have focused unduly on some of President Franklin Roosevelt's speeches in 1944, which laid out a social democratic vision for the United States of America. And you might have totally underestimated the depth of conservatism in the United States, which had been the case before 1943 and 1944, and certainly was exemplified after 1943 and 1944. So in order to tell the story of what happened in 1776, the revolt against British rule that led to the formation of the United States of America, I felt compelled to go back a century earlier, to the late 17th century. And in my telling of this story, the key event is the so-called Glorious Revolution that grips England in 1688. As a result of this, quote, glorious revolution, unquote, amongst other things, the monarchy, the king, is forced to take a step back in terms of power and influence, as against the power and influence of the rising merchant class. For the purposes of our story in this book and this afternoon, you should know that as a result of the so-called Glorious Revolution of 1688, the king was compelled to deregulate the African slave trade. To that point, the Royal African Company had been under the thumb of the monarchy and had a kind of monopoly over the trade in Africans. As you well know, Africans were enchained against their will and brought to the Americas in order to become slaves and work in the fields, in particular producing wealth for England amongst other Western European countries. But
there's a point I'm going to make about this point. In my opinion, this is kind of a central point that people like SKC want to make, and it is a bad point.
As a result of the so-called Glorious Revolution, the African slave trade was deregulated, and that led to what I refer to in this book as free trade in Africans. That is to say, the African slave trade was opened up to merchants of various sorts, private traders of various sorts, as they termed themselves. And these merchants began to descend upon the African continent with the maniacal energy of crazed bees. chaining and manacling and handcuffing virtually every African in sight and dragging them across the Atlantic, particularly to the Caribbean, that is to say, to Jamaica and Antigua and Barbados in particular. This, in some ways, is a catastrophic success for the merchants and for London itself. It's a success insofar as it produces enormous wealth for the merchants and those close to them. The profits on the African slave trade are eye-watering, eye-popping, stupendous. In some cases, 1,700% profits. As you may know, those of you who are familiar with the system known as capitalism, there are those who will sell their firstborn for 1,700% profit. Certainly, there were those who had no compunction about manacling Africans for such lucrative endeavors. This African slave trade, as previous scholars have discussed, was in many ways the fuel that provided the takeoff for capitalism. This is a conclusion that has been delivered, for example, by the former Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago, the scholar Eric Williams, a conclusion delivered by the Guyanese scholar Walter Rodney in his book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. And you should know, for our purposes here, that the profits from the African slave trade not only helped to produce sugar and tobacco, amongst other crops in profusion, helping to, for example, change the taste and appetites, particularly in Western Europe. But the profits from the African slave trade were also used to develop allied industries, banking, insurance, shipping, etc., helping to create the foundation of not only for the system that we now refer to as capitalism, but also for the economy of what is now the leading so-called superpower, that is to say, the United States of America. But the African slave trade, as noted, was a catastrophic success. The catastrophe not only comes in with regard to the lives and families of the Africans that are disrupted and seized and snatched, but in some ways it becomes a catastrophe for their captors. Because as people are dragged across the Atlantic to the Caribbean, it provides something of a demographic nightmare for the settler class in the islands. It creates great disproportions in terms of populations and numbers. In certain areas and precincts of the Caribbean, the Africans outnumber the Europeans 20-1. And this creates fertile and favorable conditions for uprisings, for revolts, for liquidation plots, for murders, for massacres, for poisonings, and not to mention preceding shipboard insurrections, all of which helps to generate a certain kind of enmity, not least between Africans and Europeans, a kind of enmity that, since we've had no Truth and Reconciliation Commission a la South Africa after the end of slavery, not to mention the end of, or the erosion of Jim Crow, those kinds of tensions have yet to be grappled with in an honest sort of way, and therefore still bubbling and percolating. Because of the tremendous explosion of slave uprisings that take place in the Caribbean, this causes many of the settlers to try to depart the Caribbean, despite the enormous profits that are being made. And what happens is that there is a great trek, as I use that term, from the Caribbean to the North American mainland. You may know that before about 1750, London thought that the Caribbean was a more profitable enterprise than the North American mainland. That is to say, the colonies that helped to form the United States of America. With this great trek of European settlers to the mainland, this creates other problems. This is all taking place in the context of competition between and amongst European powers for control of the great wealth that the Americas, particularly the Caribbean, is producing. When the British settlers and the English settlers migrate northward to the North American mainland, they then have to confront and bump up against other European powers. The Spanish in Florida and in Cuba, for example, and the French in Quebec, for example. What happens is that both of these European powers and their contestation and jousting with the British oftentimes begin to ally with the Africans under the Union Jack, under the British flag. You see this particularly in one of the more significant uprisings that takes place on the mainland of North America, which is 1712 in New York City, in Manhattan, where there is an attempt to overthrow slavery, liquidate the settler class, and establish a new polity. The 1712 uprising has French fingerprints all over it. You should also know that Britain has a particular problem in its contestation, particularly with the Spanish. This conflict between these two European powers in some ways takes the cast and the character of a religious conflict. Britain being the leading so-called Protestant power, and the Spanish and the French being the leading so-called Catholic powers. Perhaps motivated by religious bigotry, London argues that the Spanish are more prone to place arms in the hands of African troops because so many of the men under the Spanish flag are entering the priesthood because of the strictures of Catholicism. Whatever the case, it's fair to say that the Spanish had begun to arm Africans as early as the 1500s. This puts competitive pressure on the British to do the same in order to contest Spanish hegemony in certain parts of North America, not least of Spanish Florida. And as will be detailed shortly, when London yields to this competitive pressure to arm Africans under the Union Jack, under the British flag, this outrages and enrages the settlers in the 13 colonies that helped to form what is now known as the United States of America. And it is one of the points of conflict that leads to the revolt against British rule. You should also know that Britain has a demographic problem in and of itself. Even today, Britain only has a population of about 60 million compared to 300 odd million in the United States of America. And yet, as early as the 1700s, it was either building or had established a massive empire, not least a foothold in the Indian subcontinent. And yet it was having to confront and contest other European powers with not only with a relatively small population, but also Britain felt, or London felt, that under the Union Jack were other nationals, other subjects who were politically unreliable. We all know about the contested relationship between the Irish and the English, which stretches back centuries, which led many in London to feel that the Irish were not necessarily as a class politically reliable. And indeed, as I talk about in this book, there are examples of the Irish collaborating with the Africans in South Carolina against British rule. There were those in London who also felt that the Scots were not necessarily reliable politically. You may know that Scotland only comes into the United Kingdom as of 1707. In the run-up to 1776, there are many revolts against English rule, as they might have it, in Scotland, not least in the 1740s, which is a particularly tumultuous decade. And so as a result of feeling that Britain's population is not that large in the first place, that there are those who are considered to be British subjects who as a class are not politically reliable, and given the competitive pressure from the Spanish in particular in terms of arming Africans, Britain feels that it has little choice but to engage in a similar kind of practice, to arm Africans. But as you can readily glimpse, there's something of a contradiction to arming Africans to protect the slave empire, to arm Africans to protect African slavery. Obviously, this introduces tensions and conflicts and contradictions that are difficult to resolve. One possible way out, it was felt, was to establish a so-called all-white colony, which takes place, or is attempted, I should say, in what is now the state of Georgia, north of Florida and south of South Carolina. What's curious today is that Georgia, according to the 2010 census, now has the largest population of African descent in the United States of America. So to fast forward, you can see that that experiment of a so-called all-white colony did not work out very well. But it was as of 1733 that this so-called all-white colony was established in Georgia. It didn't work out very well for many different reasons. One, it was difficult for many poor Europeans to do the hard labor and hard work in the fields. Oftentimes, it was easier for them to escape because their phenotypes were not that dissimilar from the phenotypes of the planters. It was also felt by some that by introducing poor Europeans to be poor laborers, that this was introducing class tensions and class contradictions, which it was thought was the province of Europe, and that these new colonies should seek to escape that. And that leads me to another story that I try to unwind in this book, which not only is a story of the takeoff of capitalism, it's not only a story about the origins of the United States of America, it's also a story about what I call militarized identity politics. That is to say, the construction of whiteness. That is to say, how was it that those who were designated on one side of the Atlantic as English or Welsh or Irish, Scots, as they cross the Atlantic and settle into this North American mainland, their identity becomes that of white. And I think it's fair to say that the construction of whiteness, and here I'm following in the footsteps of other scholars, although I do think I might add something to this discussion, it's fair to say that this construction of whiteness helps to explain part of the success, quote unquote, of these United States of America. For example, if you look at Spanish colonialism, oftentimes Madrid took the position that in terms of their colonists, they wanted those who profess the Catholic faith. And if you have such a narrow view of colonialism, obviously you're narrowing the base, the population base for colonialism. But if your project is whiteness, basically you're appealing to those whose roots range from the Atlantic to the Urals, a tremendously sizable and large population. And when you do this in the context of calling at least a formal ceasefire, in the religious wars between Protestant and Catholic, something that is then incorporated into the vaunted First Amendment of the United States Constitution, now under assault, as we saw with the most recent Supreme Court decision on freedom of religion. When you are saying and suggesting that there's going to be a ceasefire, and I'm choosing my words carefully, in the religious wars, you're expanding the base, the population base for the colonial project. Now, I chose my words carefully because, as I'm sure you know, despite the First Amendment, the United States was a hotbed of anti-Catholicism for the first few decades of its existence, perhaps well into the 20th century, is exemplified by the travails of the first Roman Catholic president, John F. Kennedy, in 1960. And I think we need not discuss the travails, quote unquote, of the first serious Mormon or member of the Church of Latter-day Saints presidential candidate, Willard Mitt Romney, in 2012. I'm sure we need not detail the travails of anti-Semitism and anti-Jewish fervor, which was also part of the history of the United States of America, as it is to this very day. But it is fair to say that there was a formal truce, a formal ceasefire, which was quite pragmatic in the sense that it did expand the base for the colonial project in North America. So this was part of the problem with constructing the so-called all-white colony in the state of Georgia. Another problem was that across the border in St. Augustine, Florida, which bills itself as the largest urban center, or the oldest urban center, I should say, on the North American continent, you had a plethora of armed Africans going back decades, and frequently they were crossing the border to attack Georgia and to go further to attack South Carolina, which brings us to the largest and bloodiest uprising of the enslaved in British colonial history, taking place in South Carolina circa 1739, 1740. Stono's Revolt, as it has been called, interestingly enough, had the fingerprints of armed Africans from St. Augustine all over it. Stono's Revolt in South Carolina also involved Africans who had roots in Angola, Southwest Africa. Angolans who oftentimes spoke Portuguese, a language, as you know, is quite similar to Spanish, which facilitated the collaboration between the armed Africans in St. Augustine and these Africans in South Carolina. And also, perhaps not trivial, is the fact that many of these Africans in South Carolina were Catholic and therefore perhaps had some sympathy to His Catholic Majesty in Madrid. And in any case, His Catholic Majesty, in the run-up to Stono's Revolt, circa 1739 and 1740, had sent emissaries across the border, suggesting that if these Africans escaped to St. Augustine and converted to Catholicism, then they too could be incorporated into the Spanish military and could receive other kinds of benefits. So it turns out that by trying to establish this all-white colony, London had not done itself any favors. It had only complicated its colonial mission. This leads to the conclusion that the only way out for London was to oust the Spanish from Florida and the French from Quebec. That is attempted in the 1740s with mixed results. Particularly important here in the 1740s, as we march towards destiny in 1776, is the fact that the British and the Spanish crossed swords in Cartagena, which is part of what we now refer to as Colombia. And much publicity attended the fact that the British forces were shellacked, not least by armed Africans. This shellacking of the British forces in Cartagena also was facilitated by the fact that many of the European settlers on the North American mainland, and the so-called 13 colonies, were quite reluctant to come to the northern coast of South America to fight the Spanish because they were busily expropriating the indigenous and trying to manacle Africans. This was causing many Londoners to question their patriotism and also to question the nature of slavery, and of course, moving London closer to the fateful moment when it decided to try to abolish slavery in order to deal with all of these tensions and contradictions that I've laid out for you. In the 1750s, finally, London decides to make an all-out push to oust the Spanish and the French from North America. They impose taxes on the settlers in order to fund this effort. This leads to a turning point in the history of North America, if not in world history, which is the so-called 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763, where London is successful in pushing the French out of Quebec. And as you know, you still have a lingering national question of disgruntled French speakers in Quebec as we speak, and pushing the Spanish out of Florida. But in some ways, this too is a catastrophic success for London. Certainly, it's a major defeat for the Africans, because when the Spanish are pushed out of Florida, this removes a rear base from which Spanish Africans could align with the Spanish to attack their mutual antagonists in Georgia and South Carolina. But also as a result of pushing the Spanish out of Florida and the French out of Quebec, this infuriates Paris and infuriates Madrid, and it allows the French and the Spanish to then cut a deal with the settlers, the British settlers in the 13 colonies, to ally in order to push the British out of North America. This particular decision is also facilitated by another momentous event, which is June 1772, Somerset's case, whereby Lord Mansfield, a Scottish judge, by the way, rules that at least in terms of the Sceptred Isles, this part of Western Europe where London rules, that slavery would no longer persist, that it would be abolished. It does not take an oracle or a seer to divine that that decision could be exported to the North American mainland, which was the fear of many colonists. The Somerset case, this decision to abolish slavery that emerges from London in June 1772, infuriates and enrages and outrages many of the settlers. This is taking place as London is arming more Africans to send them to the North American mainland in order to patrol European settlers. This is obviously inconsistent with the settler model of development, which is based upon the relentless oppression and despotism towards people of African descent. Not only that, but they are complaining about the taxes that are being imposed, that had been imposed in order to fund and facilitate the 7 Years' War that pushed the Spanish out of Florida and the French out of Quebec, supposedly guaranteeing and securing their security. Other events that take place that are important to understand in the run-up to 1776 is that the British during the 7 Years' War not only puts the Spanish out of Florida, they temporarily push the Spanish out of Cuba, but they make a ruling that the slave trade to Cuba would be regulated, which outrages many of the slave dealers in the Carolinas in particular. They feel that this violates that cardinal principle of free trade in Africans. And then you may know that the settlers had a justifiable reputation of being past masters at smuggling. And this was a way to evade and avoid taxes. And there was one particular case that takes place at the same time the Somerset's case was erupting that is particularly critical in this eventuality. What I'm referring to is there was a ship called the Gaspee off the coast of Rhode Island that's attacked by settlers led by John Brown, who, not the anti-slavery crusader, but the man who gave his name to the Ivy League University, Brown University, a major slave dealer. And he was also a leading smuggler, and his attack on the Royal Navy led to his being captured. And as it turns out, a major witness against him is a man of African descent. And this too is infuriating to the settlers, who feel this is one more bit of evidence in terms of this, what they see as a developing alliance between Africans and London against their interests. To move the story further, let me say that another characteristic of this revolt against British rule in 1776 that leads to the formation of the United States of America is what I refer to as the Black Scare. That is to say, the fear that Britain would put more arms in the hands of Africans, and that these armed Africans would be used to discipline the settlers. And this fear comes to a kind of fruition in 1775 in the colony that is Virginia, in many ways the most prosperous and lucrative colony, a colony that had a disproportionate number of African slaves, a colony led by men who would go on to play a preeminent role in the formation of the United States of America, such as George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, et al. And as the anti-colonial revolt is brewing in Virginia, the last colonial governor, Lord Dunmore, makes the decision, the fateful decision, to establish so-called Ethiopian regiments, regiments of armed Africans that are enlisted to fight these settlers. And it takes quite a bit to encourage and entice subjects of the crown to rebel against their homeland. And one of the points that I make in this book is that one of the factors that caused so many previously, formerly patriotic British subjects to revolt against British rule was precisely this Black Scare that I argue leads to the formation of the United States of America. Now, this has particular contemporary resonance and contemporary consequences. I end this book talking about the gubernatorial election in the state of Louisiana in 1991, where the Euro-American majority votes substantially for an avowed Nazi and Klansman, David Duke, for governor. And one of the factors that leads to his not being elected, of course, is a massive turnout by the Black vote. But in many ways, the vote for David Duke, given his platform, his anti-Black platform, was in some ways a replay of the Black Scare. I should also point to you a particular passage for those who may have this book in hand on page 262, which I will now cite and read from. I say on page 262 that my deployment of the terms racist, in quotes, and racism, in quotes, is intended to invoke the political more than the biological or even the anthropological. If the latter were mostly at issue, there would be little need for these Africans to adopt other Black identities. Now, this is in the context of quoting Angela Davis, the political activist, who I'm sure you're familiar with, the contemporary political activist, who talked about growing up in Birmingham, Alabama. And in order to evade the strictures of Jim Crow and apartheid in Birmingham, Alabama, when she went into department stores, she would oftentimes speak French. Or James Weldon Johnson, a leader in the first few decades of the 20th century of the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, a leading civil rights organization. And growing up in Jacksonville, Florida, he would do the same thing, except he would speak Spanish. And somehow he felt he would receive different treatment. The same holds true for Raymond Pace Alexander, a Black lawyer who spoke Spanish, whose roots were in Philadelphia. I also cite the case of, and for those of you who are jazz fans, Babs Gonzalez. In his memoir, I Paid My Dues, Good Times, No Bread. Born Lee Brown in Newark, New Jersey, this US Negro, a noted musician, adopted a Spanish-tinged name, Babs Gonzalez, in order to, as he saw it, escape the persecutorial fate he felt was the birthright of descendants of mainland enslaved Africans. I also go on to quote from a book I wrote about Kenya a few years ago, where the US State Department, when Kenya was rising to independence, it was felt that it would complicate relations with Nairobi if Kenyan diplomats coming to Washington, which was then a Jim Crow town, would be subjected to Jim Crow. So they suggested that the Africans were badges so that they would not be mistaken for Black Americans. So the point that I'm trying to make is that, number one, that racism is a necessary explanatory factor in talking about what has befallen people of African descent in North America, particularly the population we now refer to as African American. But it's not sufficient. It's not a sufficient explanation, because if it were wholly sufficient, well, then being able to speak French in Birmingham, Alabama during the Jim Crow era, it would not have helped you at all. What I'm trying to suggest is that there has been a special persecution of the descendants of mainland enslaved Africans, which is not to say that others who are Black or of African descent have not faced persecution, but that it is to say that there is a kind of special persecution that we must take into account in the academy. For example, when we talk about African diaspora studies, it must be taken into account politically as well. Perhaps, as some like to say, that it's no accident that two of the highest ranking officials under the US flag thus far have been of Jamaican and Kenyan descent. But it's also fair to say, as I wind up, that when we look at the headlines and we look at the rates of imprisonment of Black Americans, when we look at those who disproportionately populate death row and are subject to execution, such as the botched execution in Oklahoma a few days ago, when we scrutinize carefully the poisoned words of Donald Sterling that I'm sure you're familiar with, when you examine the recent Department of Education study that suggested that Black preschoolers are suspended at rates spectacularly higher than other preschoolers, leading to a letter writer writing to the New York Times just a few weeks ago, suggesting that we may be marching to a destiny where Black infants are segregated on the premise that they may cry louder. And he said that, the letter writer said that jokingly, but this may be the path, well, this may be the path that we're on. I say all of this to say that as I wind up this Shirley Kennedy Memorial Lecture, about the consequences of the formation in 1776 of the United States of America, allow me to say that the past is not past, it's still with us, and that, as Barack Obama suggested when asked in Malaysia about the comments of Donald Sterling, and he suggested that this was part of the continuing legacy of slavery and Jim Crow. He had a point. I would only go a step further and suggest that in terms of dealing with this poisonous continuing legacy of slavery and Jim Crow, it is long past time to take into account and consideration some of the factors that I've mentioned in the past 2 minutes, but also to take into account the examples of other countries, such as South Africa, which had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission in the aftermath of apartheid in order to sort out the destructive and damaging consequences of that particular system of hatred. And we would be well advised to emulate the South Africans and act similarly. I'll stop there. I assume I can take questions and comments at this point. So thank you very much for your attention. And as you're thinking your questions and comments, let me make a few other points. One of the points I tried to introduce in this book also are points about comparative history. That is to say that Australia, which I wrote about in the book, The White Pacific, has a history, as Australians will quick to point out, that's very similar to that of the United States. But what's different about Australia is that there's much more of a critical history about the dispossession of the indigenous population and the violent implantation of white supremacy, unlike the rather glorified romantic history that even progressive and even some radical historians have put forward. If you look at Canada, which is something of a control group, since it was also under the Union Jack, but did not have a, quote, revolution, unquote. Yet if when you compare Canada to the United States today, Canada, as you may know, has that single-payer healthcare system that progressive people tell us the United States should have opted for. Canada now, according to objective indices, the working class and the middle class have a higher standard of living than its counterparts and peers in the United States of America. Canada has a progressive party, the New Democratic Party, which has ruled certain provinces, that is certainly more far-reaching and more advanced than anything on this side of the border. I should also say that it is fair to suggest that the United States has rescued many Europeans from persecution and from poverty. But I should say in that context that if you look at the history of the Dominican Republic, you may know that in the 1930s, the Dominican dictator, Rafael Trujillo, opened his doors wide to those fleeing persecution in Germany in particular, and Europe in general. Of course, he did so for reasons you may find odious, that is to say that he was, by his own admission, trying to, quote, whiten, unquote, the population. And at the same time that he was opening the door wide to those fleeing European persecution, he was massacring Haitians on the border. Now, I'm sure that even progressive people in the United States, when they would look at the Dominican Republic, they would not necessarily salute Rafael Trujillo for rescuing European refugees without at the same time broadening the context and bringing in some of these other factors that I was just laying before you. But I'm afraid that that's not necessarily the standard or the criteria that's used with regard to comparable situations in terms of these United States of America.
Hey, Stanley. You working double time today, I see.
Apparently, I'm bored.
Yeah.
Look, anytime, and we got 9 people who are interested in history, apparently.
Yeah. Well, I was wondering if you could post a link to that guy's book in the back chat. 'Cause
Absolutely.
I wouldn't mind
And,
buying that book.
his name is Gerald Horn. He's actually
Gerald
fairly
Horn.
hold on one sec. I will
Okay.
get you. And he's got plenty of videos. Look, this guy's actually now. I warn you now, he is a leftist, but he's not as left
That's
as
all
he used
right.
to be. But
I'm not
he
a
is
partisan hack, Stanley.
let me I think he is, let me put it to you this way. He's a historian and a big Du Bois fan. He tends to view American history in a way that is actually true. Look, slavery was not good, and in a myriad of ways, there are plenty of historians who are as eminent, but he is actually this is the weird thing. People want it's hard to describe, and I'm a little blasted. So, I'm not as
That's all
articulate
right.
as usual. No,
God
it's not all
forgives
right.
you.
God isn't going to teach you history or anyone else. He's going to make you
Yeah, I
learn.
really enjoyed. Like, I couldn't follow all of it because I'm kind of slow, Stanley. But you made some great
Look,
historical points.
some points that the dude is not shy with any footnotes at all. That's the good thing. He encourages you to read the primary sources. You don't have to see, that's the wonderful thing about history books. If you disagree with the interpretation, a good historian tells you why he or she thinks that. It's called footnotes. And the funny thing about history books is half of the book will be them listing their sources. It's
I
not
bet when he was in grade school, the high school, he was more educated by his family and people that knew him. He wasn't educated as a young age in public school. He got a lot of private.
I actually bet he was educated in public school. I don't know that much about him.
Yeah. Definitely an interesting guy. Like, he pointed out a lot of things that I didn't know about American history. And here I was thinking I'm almost an expert. No fucking where near it, Stanley.
Well, neither am I. You are not the only one. I'm going to put the Wikipedia page, and you can follow his bibliography from there.
Oh, okay.
And this dude is interesting. He is literally Berkeley and Ivy League. And he is also prolific. He just knows his shit, and I admire that.
Yeah, I like the way he sticks to facts and doesn't diddle daddle in the politics, really. You know what I'm saying?
Oh, he can. As a matter of fact, if you want to know, look, there are historians. He's my favorite male historian. There's a second one, which we're about to see. We're gonna take this from 7 down to 2. It might just be you and me.
Well, sometimes it works out that way.
And sometimes it should. But if you, dude, here's the deal. He doesn't just talk about American history. He's written a couple books
Yeah.
for American history. He literally has woven a narrative, a very cogent narrative. Up to he is worth reading up to Texas independence, and then he goes back 2 or 3 centuries before that.
Oh wow!
Interesting, and it is he puts his notes. All good historians do. So I'm excited that you care. I'll put it that way.
Well, I'm surprised he goes back further than what's his name, that first marshal, and that was Oklahoma, and he went out. He went out from Fort Smith. And damn it, I can't think of his name right now, but it goes way back before that,
Mm-hmm.
and
Well, he's
shows
not the only one. I mean, there are people who wrote about it. He just kind of puts it all together.
What's his name?
in a
Ben
narrative.
something. His name was Ben something. First ever black U.S. Marshal. What year?
Oh no, I don't think Gerald Horne has ever written about that part. And much like being a doctor, these people actually specialize in 100-year increments. The American historians are actually rather interesting. And this is a guy, this is literally the original Constitution, what it really was. And here's another fairly eminent historian. Now this guy has a different narrative. This is Constitution, and his shtick, this historian, is his thing is he specializes in revolutions, rebellion. He has a book coming out in the fall, which I'm gonna buy. And we might not look, this particular stream is not gonna last all night because I will run out of steam. But this is my second favorite male historian because
we can continue to do this. I'm very much interested in how.
Let's see how this goes. This is going to be about the American
the podcast
Constitution
and the other materials that I hope are helpful. It seems that a number of you have had issues finding a decent copy of the Constitution. For some reason, I just sort of assumed that everybody had something like a pocket Constitution. But we'll work these out. I've got a bunch of these that I had purchased for my students that I can always send out to you too.
Shredder, come on now.
You see no delay. David, hi. Marilyn, hi. No delay. That's awesome. That's
this
great.
Is
there's no delay. I really.
This is a live stream that is recorded. It's not live now, but this dude actually has a following and does Constitution talks online, and he's not the only one. There are historians who do live streams about topics, and people can ask questions. People don't know this, which is surprising. You can actually talk to historians if you want.
Appreciate that. So let me know what it is that you think about. I've got to get back down into the comments on the Patreon. Being a dad and doing all the rest of this stuff is it's a lot of time. But
and I am thinking about getting a Patreon or something like that. I might have to go rogue. He is now he is interesting. He's a public historian. His shtick is he's worked in Williamsburg, he's worked at Monticello, he's worked at Mount Vernon. His shtick is, hey, let's make public history is his thing. We need to make American history available to American citizens, and I totally admire that.
I really appreciate it. And the whole podcast thing I thought was a different way to get you the kind of material for those of you having engaged with so many of you about this. I want to make sure that you're getting materials, that I'm getting stuff to you that is in fact valuable. And people learn, they consume, they layer meaning in different ways, and that and I want to make sure that that I'm trying to get things to you in ways that are useful. Kelly, everything instills hope. Senator Byrd gave me your copy with George in the front. Wow, Senator Byrd. Gotcha. He kind of he carried right. Senator Byrd of West Virginia.
What
That's
on
Senator
earth
Byrd.
are you talking about, Shredder?
He was in the Senate when I worked in the Senate. Interesting guy. David, do you think the podcasts are great? You know, there are those of you who asked.
Now, here's the deal. I'm not much into all the pedigree stuff. This dude is an elite historian. He has a pedigree. So pedigree isn't everything, but the wonderful thing is his mission is here's the book. Read it. Write a book on what you read. I admire people who actually confront American history and write their opinions on it. You can do it. Anyone can do it, but you also have to do the homework. And he's a white devil is not history. That is problematic.
What that is, it is AI driven.
And you know what? That you didn't read the book. I don't need to read a book. We got to do better, folks.
It is part of it's I forget what it's called. I'll let you know what it is. But it is, you put in the data and it just automatically generates the podcast. And I was a little skeptical about it, but I was working on a project with a colleague, and he just sent me the podcast,
I might have to skip through some of it.
Basically, this project
I
we were
don't
working
care
on based
about
upon
any of
materials
this.
that I had written, and I thought that it was actually just a podcast, and because it was, the voices are so good, and but I think it's a great learning tool. Although I'm a little skeptical of anything that is entirely digitally generated. That's why I don't even do digital images very much. So it just creeps me out. Gifted a pocket Constitution on Constitution Day, December 17th. Oh, that's cool. That is, I think that everybody should walk around with one, but I think that coming along with it means that kind of being able to read the Constitution.
He is literally talking about a pocket Constitution you could buy at a dime store. Why don't people read the Constitution? Can someone tell me? It is literally there for you to read. Is that Sam Fisher?
That I'm kind of like the way we're doing it. It's very interesting how to hear the way people come to understand the Constitution, the way that they come to their appreciation of it. I mean, we have talked about this, about all of the different ways in which people come to understand the past, but particularly when it's something as important as the Constitution. And what is so interesting is that I have never, and please let me know, all of you, what it is that you think, but that we are that I have never been in a period in my life in which there's been so much discussion about the Constitution, so many references to the Constitution, whether it's due process or whether it's birthright citizenship. And why? It's because we have a government that is, regardless of where you are on the political or authority spectrum, is calling these issues into question. That constitutional literacy is probably more important now than ever. And but I don't hear a more informed discussion. I don't go on Threads or Blue Sky and see more informed posts about the Constitution. What I do is I hear a lot of assumption, a lot of presumption, and people throwing out things about the Constitution, which is why I often, when I'm on Threads or Blue Sky, which I don't really go on very often, but when I do, it is you're just playing this game of, and particularly because of the way the algorithm works, that you're playing this game of just seeing all of this content in front of you. And David, you see this all the time, I think, that people just getting it wrong. And you're like, what do we do about this other than have conversations like this, right? Yeah. Oh no, I think AI is useful. I think it's useful as any kind of tool. You just got to be very careful about it. Particularly because of the way it will lie confidently. That's kind of the issue. But I think that, and there are 13 people here. That's great. Yeah, there is such misinformation out there, Lori. Hi. And there are, what I don't understand are the number of people who are willing to wallow in the misinformation. And this isn't a right thing. It's not a left thing. It's not a center thing. It's just a anti-being wrong thing. And when you try to educate people, when you try to correct the misinformation, before it turns into disinformation, right? Because there are plenty of people out there willing to purposefully engage in purveying inaccurate information in projects of disinformation, that they are very defensive about it. So if you want to go ahead and point out that, that's actually not what the 3/5 compromise is about. That's not what, and I'm not talking about people like the Lieutenant Governor of Kentucky or the school superintendent of Oklahoma, who they get it wrong on purpose, but the people who would otherwise be of good faith and good heart and good mind, we've talked about this, that I don't understand that okay, we want to get this right? We want to make sure that we understand the Constitution properly, so that you can debate from a position of knowledge, so you can act from a position of knowledge, that you can do that. We want to do that, right? No one reads it, but it's not that. See, David, this is one of the points that I wanted us to do, is that it's 6 pages. It's just 6 pages. The original Constitution that I posted, that is 6 pages long. The executive takes up more than half of it. So Article 1 takes up more than half of it. Article 2 on the legislative takes up a lot less. The judiciary is almost nothing.
Yes,
and then you have the final couple of sections that are.
Yeah, the purpose of the pocket constitution is to hand out for free, and the Declaration of Independence, even the drug addicts and people everywhere, so that they know their right. That's the purpose of the pocket constitution. I don't know
what you think?
Yeah, because one of my representatives does that every year. Hands out a bunch of pocket constitutions for you to pass out, right? So depending on how many you take from the stack is how many you gotta hand out to different people. That way they know it. And plus they have it.
You know what? I think the reason people don't read it is, or it needs to be handed out, is people do not know their rights.
Kind of like the
To me,
Bible, huh, Stanley?
no, it's not. It's not kind of like the not like the Bible. As a matter of fact, there are two different truths. Everyone who goes to first grade will hear about the Constitution from first grade on. And what's amazing is only the drug addicts or the formers are the ones reading the Constitution. That's a huge problem. More people should read it.
Yeah, I agree.
Look,
But
did you see that video about the kid who got punched by the cop? He was like, "Well, it's my right." No, it's not your right. Everyone wants to talk about rights without understanding, do you have a right in this situation? Constitution
What?
is not going to tell you everything you need to know day to day.
Right.
It's going to tell you a lot.
Yeah. It's gonna, if you can
Constitution is not
understand
going.
basic
The Constitution, yes, but the Constitution is not going to tell you if a cop says you're under arrest, you're done. You don't have the right to say no, I'm not under arrest, or you come and get me. You lose your rights once someone with a lawful requirement, of course, that person's going to have to be right. People don't understand what their rights are. And they don't know that every right you have, you lose rights if you're suspected of violating someone else's rights or a law. People think that when you're in the grocery store and you call someone a fucker, and then they get offended and you say, well, I have a right to say what I want to say. Actually, you don't. You do not have a right. That First Amendment is what the government can't do. The government can't deprive you of your rights, but everyone else can. That's what people don't understand. The Constitution is largely what the national government cannot do. Now, some are positive rights. People don't understand that part. You don't have a right to say what you want when you want to say it, and to whom. People don't understand that. And it's a problem. It is a huge problem. So
No, I agree with that, Stanley. I mean, like you could grab somebody in Walmart or something, doesn't mean that they can't knock you out for doing so.
well, when your rights intersect with someone else's equal rights, then that's where the law comes in. Who has the right? That's what the courts are for, or statutes. People
Yeah,
don't know.
I've seen this one video earlier. This cop pulling over a United Arab Emirate in like California or some goddamn where. He acted like he was above the law because he had diplomatic immunity, and in the end, the
But you
emirate
know
was
that
right. He
person,
let him go.
you could deport that. Well, I hope that person got deported.
Yeah, me
No,
too.
seriously.
But
If
the
you're gonna
cop,
be here under someone else's jurisdiction, and you can't like diplomatic rights, dude, your ass gets deported
the cop
if you can't
ended up
follow those laws.
Stanley. The cop was deported, and then I bet you he's applying for ICE right now, probably. He slapped that Arab in his face. for
Brian
being
Nichols.
so disrespectful.
Well, let's you and I address Brian Nichols here. In my first elementary school, we did, and I assume that means you went to another elementary school at some point. And then I have a funny question to ask after this. Pledge of Allegiance, sang My Country 'Tis of Thee, and the national anthem every morning. Did they give you what's more important than pledging allegiance? Dude, the Constitution was 1789. My Pledge of Allegiance, that Pledge of Allegiance thing, that's 1950s. Who gives a fuck, Brian Nichols?
Yeah.
Your first grade teacher, before you sang my country 'tis of thee, you need to understand the country. And I understand it's only first grade. So why you would bring that up when we're talking about the Constitution means you never graduated from elementary school.
Stanley, did you have
Well,
to say
it's a
that?
well, let me let Brian Nichols know that was a joke.
Didn't you have to say the Pledge of Allegiance in school, Stanley? Like grade school and high school?
I'm sure we did. We also prayed.
Yeah.
Well, that was Catholic school though.
Yeah. Well, yeah, of course. They said the Pledge of Allegiance in Catholic school?
Absolutely.
Wow. Only went to private and homeschool.
Why would you be surprised?
I don't know, because they don't do it in class today, do they? Like anywhere?
I haven't
I'm
been
not
to Catholic
even sure
school.
if they do it here.
I have not been in a Catholic school in goddamn, I'm 60, over 22 years. So I don't know what they do. But back in my day, and Brian Nichols is an old man, so he's similar to me.
Yeah, Brian Nichols has been around for a while on this channel.
Oh, that motherfucker's been around in life. I don't think he's 60 yet, though.
They're not terribly important. So the substantive parts of the Constitution that we really talk about, partly because that part of the Constitution is 6 pages, the core part of the Constitution, and most of that's Article 1, 2, and 3, right? The executive, legislative, and the judiciary. But then people make all these assumptions about the amendments, and the amendments obviously run to a number of pages, but those are tacked on to the actual Constitution. They're not part of the Constitution, and that was on purpose, right? This is part of, and we'll talk about this in a couple of weeks when we get to it. But when it came time to actually, when the fight got to the point of in 1790, when they pushed these things through the House and the Senate, it was the first proposition was to include any changes. Madison's first proposal that he's pushed into is to incorporate the changes into the body of the Constitution. Well, except the House of Representatives, the first federal Congress that is predominantly filled with federalists, with nationalists. They didn't want to change anything in the Constitution in the first place. And so they decided not to change anything in the Constitution. So there were a whole host of amendments that would have
Then
changed
there's
the
the Bill
language
of
of the
Rights.
Constitution then and there. But they wanted to set a precedent of not changing the body of the Constitution. And that's what we're stuck with, right? We're stuck with the legacy of that precedent. That they didn't want not a word of the Constitution changed, which is why they're all tacked on to the end. They were supposed to be incorporated into the body of the Constitution. That's a major change, but you're right. It's not that long. I don't know why people don't read it. A weekly reading of the national documents like a Torah. Well, as long as the thing is, I don't think the language is.
Well, one of the things is there, and you won't believe this or not, there is literally a underground fight there is a post Civil War Constitution, which people call the second founding, where the it became a quote multiracial democracy. And before that, there are people who still want to fight for the original Constitution pre-Civil War. And that's actually kind of a major fight these days. But no one talks about it.
All of that. And you
Except
I
on
don't
channels
think the
like this.
language
Yes,
is
sir.
Can we talk about what it takes to change the original Constitution? Is so many states have to sign on to it, and then 2/3 of the legislature, and then 2/3 of all the state legislatures have to agree to each amendment. So they made it very difficult to do a
It's 3/4.
constitutional convention. Yeah, 3/4. I'm
Oh,
sorry.
I thought it
My
was
number though.
3/4.
It might be. I know it's either 2/3 or maybe 3/4.
It's
The better
it's
part
actually
of all the almost everybody has to agree, or 3/4 of the states, and then 3/4 of the House and Senate. That's a very difficult thing to achieve, to change the actual Constitution. Yeah, I don't think it'll ever be done. Not in today's divided society. It'll never be done.
You know what? Well, requirements. Oh, there it is. Process.
I think there's so
You're
many
right.
states.
No, you're right. 2/3. I'm
Yeah,
thinking
and it's
3/4.
and it's so many states that have already signed on
Oh,
to it, but not enough.
This is where I once proposed. This is what I'm thinking of. 3/4, but
Yeah.
2/3 vote House of Representatives and Senators. I'm gonna have to remember this. It's 2/3, then 3/4. Gotcha.
Yeah.
My
So they
bad.
made it basically impossible to change the Constitution. Is what they did.
Well, he will make a point. However, it's been done 27 times. But the problem is 27 times. Actually, he's going to make the point at some point that it's only 15 times, but even 27 times over 250 years, it hasn't been a lot. And let's not say impossible, just like practically impossible.
Yeah. However you want to spin it, Stanley. It'll still be hard to get through that.
Oh, me, I don't think that this is embedded in deeply learned 18th century language that you really have to understand. There are no really deep philosophical issues that are dealt with in there. That's one of the things that they didn't get into. That would involve something like a Bill of Rights. Unpacking the Bill of Rights requires unpacking such a thing as freedom of conscience. But understanding not ending the slave trade for 20 years. I'm pretty sure that people can get that. Oh, Nico. Oh, hey, Nico. By the way, welcome back. The fetishization of the Constitution as the unbinding document is depressingly common sight. And this is the point that I make consistently about the valorization of the founders. That every time, and even just using those kind of terms, like we've created this vocabulary around this era that we don't apply to any other period in American history. But they have titles. They are teams. They're like the Avengers. They are the founders, the framers. And while no one is willing to particularize or disaggregate those terms, like we should, everybody who's a patriot or everybody who's on the right side of things gets thrown into one of these terms. So what we call it, the founding. Like there should be, I don't know, harps going off in the background, and we refer to them as founders or framers in these heroic, this heroic vocabulary, and that immediately distances us from this just being a framework of government, and it's either it might have been better than, like we talked about last week, it might have been better than the articles, but better if you're James Madison, not better if you're Patrick Henry or Mercy Otis Warren. It's a relative measure rather than in the moment, understanding that this is in fact just a tool, and it can be changed, and it should be changed.
Let me address this
as Jefferson.
disturbing point. The founders are God's disciplines. Disciples. I bet he meant disciples. No, they're not.
Argued later, like you should not be expected to wear the same coat as a young man that you did as a child. That it doesn't make any sense to actually apply that same rule to your government. It is intensely tragic, Nico. Has anyone? No, Kelly, no one has rewritten the Constitution to include the amendments, incorporate them. No, they haven't. Even though, again, that was the assumption at the beginning, is that they would be in there, and had they been put in there as part of the addition of the Bill of Rights, then I think a different, like we said, precedent would have been set, that it is changeable. Back. You can change your words, but Madison had gone on. We'll talk about this a little bit today, because we want to talk about the Philadelphia Convention. We will talk about how you get to this 6 pages, but he argued, and all the nationalists did, but Madison and Hamilton and Morris and Jay, even though he's not at the Constitutional Convention, argued that their strategy coming out of the Constitutional Convention is to push quickly through state conventions, not through the Confederation Congress, not through state legislatures, but directly to state ratifying conventions, to push the document, those 6 pages that we read for today, straight to the states, an up or down vote, accept it all or accept nothing. And by the way, if you accept nothing, then the entire country is going to fall apart. But don't change a word. And if that's where you're going in terms of your political strategy and your tactics, then that's what gets into everybody's mind. So if you're going to set those as the terms of the debate coming out of Philadelphia in September 1787, going through the ratifying conventions of 1787 and 1788, and then into the first Federal Congress in 1789, then what do? Then you're stuck with the terms of that debate, which is the terms of the history that it became. The nationalists set the terms of the debate. That turns into the Federalist interpretation, and then that creates the mythology, and then we're stuck with the damn mythology because no one is willing to question it. And if you're not willing to question it, then you can't change it. And that is, to me, intensely stupid. And well, more to the point, counterproductive. And then there's the Convention of States. No, I mean, it's in there. This is Article 5, right? The Article 5. But David, if you want to say more about that, about what you mean by that, but there are 2 processes for amending the Constitution, right? That there is the Convention of States, and this is what this is one of the things that the reason why Madison, we're jumping ahead, but I think that you guys don't mind, that one of the reason why Madison wanted to control the amendment process in the first Federal Congress was because Patrick Henry and the opposition in the states were pushing for the other Article 5 process, which is a Convention of States. You can amend the Constitution in 2 different ways: through Congress, then being sent to the states, or a number of states can call a convention. That has never happened. That has always been threatened I mean, it's been threatened since the Hartford Convention and in the early 1800s. But it's always kind of been threatened. People have always working on changing the Constitution, calling convention states. So it's not really a modern thing. That you can go to almost any point across the history of the United States, and there is a movement underfoot, usually by some sort of, I don't want to say extreme group, but a fringe group maybe, to put together a convention of states to call a convention, because it should enable the people to do this. It should enable enough states to do this, but because there is no way to kind of organize this, and no, it's weird that it's no serious. There's been no real serious movement to do this. Although the most recent one is probably the most serious one they've been, but they're still not going to get close enough. It's too big. So authoritarians from the beginning, this Kelly is the big thing for us to understand about the nationalists, and I think that it's important, and that's actually a good way to introduce coming into Philadelphia. So let's talk about authoritarian.
By the way, he calls the Federalists nationalists. So, he's making them a synonym. And there's a reason he doesn't.
From the beginning, because you don't know the half of it, but that's what we're here to do.
By the way,
we talked
I'm
about the
not
road
sure
to
I
Philadelphia
agree with
and getting there by May
political
25th,
comparison.
1787. So there are delegates that are elected. They're not encouraged to come. So if we pick up where we left off, they're not encouraged to come because they don't think it's legitimate. That will do anything more than the Annapolis Convention did in September of '86, until Washington decides to attend. But then that gets a lot of the other nationalists on board. So there are 74 delegates who are elected to the Philadelphia Convention from each of the states. I mean, we read for last week and I think that for this week, but the Articles of Confederation what the Confederation Congress actually asked them to do. They elected delegates. They're mostly nationalists. Only 55 show up. And enough of them trickle in by May 25th to actually have a quorum to actually get work done. And their first thing that they do is that they elect Washington to preside. Not to speak, that's not Washington's thing, but to preside over the convention. But one of the first orders of business, and they spend the next couple of days organizing, but one of the first things that they decide to do, and this kind of gets to Kelly's point about being authoritarians, is that, and this is what ticks off Thomas Jefferson and it ticks off Patrick Henry, is that they decide that the whole thing is going to be held in secret. Which, for people who have spent years talking about they want to be a republic, and then this is going to be in the name of the people, then their first decision is to go ahead and make sure that nothing leaks out, that they make a pledge to one another as a term of the convention, that none of this will be made
Well,
public.
let me
talk
make a
about it.
point here. If it ticked off Thomas Jefferson, he was in France. So what did it matter?
To anybody else. They can't write about it to anybody else. They're not going to let anybody else in. Nobody is going to hear about this. They're not even going to keep public records, which is why we know, in fact, so little about what happened inside of the convention. We have Madison's notes, which are the single greatest source we have about what happened in the Constitutional Convention. He kept notes almost every day. Not every day, but almost every day. There are some other delegates who kept a couple of notes, and then we also know from them writing home.
And see, this is where the accept all or nothing. No, absolutely, you are wrong, Brian Nichols. There was compromise. Tell us what the compromise was, Professor Brian Nichols. It wasn't accept all or nothing. And if there is accept all or nothing, who are the ones proposing it? And I'm not asking the question oddly. Let's see what the fuck you actually know. And I'm dead serious. Or stop talking about it.
But there were no public records. There was no like clerk of the convention whose job it was.
By the
to
way,
take notes,
I have read
to keep
Madison's
records.
notes.
There is no record of anything
I
at the
actually
convention.
own it
All
on
we have
Kindle
are
somewhere.
these. All we have are some notes by the delegates, and mainly of Madison. So they are largely colored by him. So depending on what you think about Madison as a reporter, then that's what we get. But that tells you that something is going on, right? There's no stomach to change the sacred constitution. I don't think Kelly, I think you're right. There is no stomach to change the sacred constitution. But we got to talk about how it gets sacred. So one of the first things they do is they close it down, they make it secret. And then they move on the fourth day after they get organized, because they're not like meeting for like 8 hours a day. They're meeting for like 3 or 4 hours a day. And then on the fourth day is when Edmund Randolph sets the terms of the debate by introducing the Virginia Plan. And this, Kelly, this gets to your point as being authoritarians. They knew from the very beginning, the core nationalists, Madison and Edmund Randolph and Hamilton, and Morris, and Washington, know from the very beginning what it is they're going to do. They know that they want to go ahead and violate the terms by which they were meeting from the Confederation Congress. They want a new government. Madison's been working on this idea for years, and they introduce the Virginia Plan on like May 28th or May 29th. And that is, okay, here's a new government. It's got 3 branches, and it is, it's a couple of things that I think would surprise you. The main thing is that it would annihilate the power of the states. The idea of the first plan for the Constitution was to make sure that that Congress, that the federal government, would have the same supremacy over the state governments that the British Parliament had over the colonial assemblies, that they would have the last word, that they could actually veto state laws, and that any law passed by the federal Congress would actually override any state laws. That everything would absolutely flow from it. That's the first idea. That's the Virginia Plan. We will then talk about Hamilton's plan, but that is what they start with out of the gate, to annihilate the states and to have the federal government that would veto all state action, and to have this, to consolidate all power in the federal government. So this is, when you're talking about this and people saying, oh, well, Madison really thought that they wanted to balance stuff. No, he didn't. They wanted to consolidate all power into one centralized national government that would leave the states with no say whatsoever in anything. And that was, they certainly seem to be for the people. They should be. I wish I could actually hear you. That way we could get some inflection there. Seem to be for the people. They only just consider groups and people who projected their interests of capital PB people. Right. I mean, when we talk about those first 3 letters of the preamble, first 3 words of the preamble, we the people, right? We don't get a discussion really about what that means until the ratifying conventions. But for most people, Nico, I think that you are absolutely right, that it's we the people, as Joe McGill puts it, we the people in this room, that the people are the people whom they represent and the people whom they assume that they will always represent, who will be part of the country, who are in a republic, have legitimately claim the benefits and responsibilities of citizenship, and that are free white men of some level of property. So that is we the people. But they don't get to the preamble for a bit. They first got to get through the Virginia Plan. So they spend 10 days debating the Virginia Plan, and I hope that this is not. I'm seeing this hitch up a little bit, but I hope that it's not showing up that way to you guys. The folks from the smaller states come up with the New Jersey Plan in June, and that essentially is trying to put a stop on things, because the large states would absolutely be overrepresented in the Virginia plan, in the Madison plan, and just run roughshod over everything. Because if Virginia and New York are going to control everything, it's a lot of the debate that you run into today when you hear people talk about the electoral college. Oh my gosh, that this is where the tyranny of the majority comes in. Which is silly, but we'll get to that later. But the folks from the smaller states come up with a New Jersey plan, which is just to present the idea, and this is the last stopgap against the nationalists. There's a small group from the smaller states that say, no, let's just stop and do what it is that the Confederation Congress asked us to do. So the New Jersey plan isn't really an alternative. The New Jersey plan is to say, let's actually not deal with your extreme alternative. Let's do what we were told to do. And let's, in fact, just revise the Articles of Confederation. Let's strengthen it on the grounds that you, James Madison, say that are the reason why we're here in the first place. What is wrong with the Articles? They can't regulate commerce. Therefore, we can't have a strong financial system. Therefore, we can't really negotiate treaties or really cut a figure on the world stage where we're a legitimate power on terms with Great Britain or France to be able to negotiate trade deals. We can't, after Daniel says, oh my God, we can't secure our own domestic affairs. Okay, well, then let's go ahead and just propose changes to the Articles that will fix those things, particularly in terms of raising revenue and taxation and things like that. Something that's a little more secure about that. Let's do that. How quickly do you think that it takes the nationalists to rally around punting that or completely just destroying that idea? Nico, America seems inseparable from existence as a colonial project, with every part of its history reflecting the interest of dehumanizing and Well, listen, I mean, I'm sure everybody else can see these comments. Nico, from my standpoint, Nico is absolutely right. That if we accept, just accept from their standpoint, from their point of view, that they were creating a country for themselves, for the people whom they thought mattered. And they can use whatever kind of inclusive language that the Enlightenment more or less dictated, right? If we want to think about there being an Enlightenment vocabulary and a language of liberty that comes out of the Enlightenment, then an easy way to look at it for me is that there are different, and we stick with that as being a framework, then there are dialects to that language of liberty. And the American dialect is heavily influenced by the presence of chattel slavery. So when you're using words like liberty and slavery, if you are Montesquieu, for instance, and you're writing about liberty and slavery, or if you're Rousseau and you're writing about liberty and slavery, and you're in France in the 1750s and 1760s, then a word like slavery, you are using entirely as an abstraction. You are thinking about it as political slavery. You're thinking about it as philosophical slavery. You're not thinking about it as literal slavery. Rousseau, when he wrote, men are free yet everywhere are in chains, he's not thinking literally about that. But in America, and I'm using that term broadly conceived from Nova Scotia to the Bahamas, America must deal with those words in their literal sense, in their physical sense, not as abstractions. And so part of the American dialect of the Enlightenment is to adapt the meaning of those words and their relationship to each other, liberty and slavery, entirely with the presence of chattel slavery and what is going to be an ongoing presence of chattel slavery in mind. How do you reconcile these things? And they reconcile them pretty easily in the way that they are entirely, and this goes back to Kelly's point too, that they are going to be exclusionary and exclusive in who they mean liberty is for from the very, very, very beginning, in almost everything that they do. And if you understand that everybody's as just a part of this very exclusive club, then things are a lot easier, rather than assuming that they thought that any of them had the vision that of any day, that any of this would actually apply to anybody beyond their own demographic. And to be very clear about all of that. And when we can talk about that in terms of the Constitution, about what it says and doesn't say about things like religion, right? That, you know, why is there in the Constitution no religious test for public office? Although that occupies more of the Constitutional Convention debate than does any kind of discussion about slavery or the slave trade. Because all of them are more or less on the same side of believing that political authority is only safely in the hands of Protestant Christians. And which is why in most of the state constitutions, there are religious tests. So anyway, so after you get back, exclusion is fundamental to the U.S. Enlightenment Project. Nico, I'm now kind of seeing the founding fathers as the tech pros of the time. I think that's a good simile, right? A bunch of young guys trying to tear apart and reconstruct a world they barely understand with their own country as the start. Yeah, I think that let's think about them from the tech pro standpoint, right? As people, right? This matters. That if you think about them, the folks who are the core of the nationalists, and I think we talked about this a little bit last week, but the core of the nationalists are all in their 30s. They're all relatively young people, you know, Madison and Hamilton and Randolph. But they come to political maturity under the umbrella of these broader continental institutions, whether that is the Continental Congress or the Continental Army. They are really young when the Revolutionary War begins, so they kind of come of age, and their view of the world is shaped by these broader institutions that are products of the revolutionary resistance movement. They create these parallel institutions in order to foster the resistance.
Folks, I am going to sign off. I have done the white man's burden for the night. So I am going to listen to Drip's show until I fall asleep. Might read a book, might not. Who knows? I will probably not be up at 5:45 unless I wake up, but I'll try and do a show later in the morning. Might take this up, might just bore every motherfucking body. To me, this is important stuff. So, Brian Nichols, I actually enjoyed your pithy comments. So, thank you, sir. So, yep, I will sign off. And I appreciate the folks who have stuck this one out. It is boring as hell. History is boring as hell. But, to folks who don't like it, I guess. But Brian Nichols, tell me what you want to watch. Is a history whatever. That can be done. So, I will see everyone at some point in the morning. I don't have one scheduled. If I do a show in the morning, I'll just reschedule for the next days. So, see y'all later.